Good morning, interweb. Let's create some pronoun systems, shall we? So the main thing that pronouns, aka person markers, do is encode the grammatical category of person. To explain, any given conversation may have up to 3 participants: the speaker, the addressee, and a party being talked about. We call the speaker the first person, the addressee the second person, and the party being talked about the third person. I strongly suggest starting with this very common 3-person setup, just like in English. Now create a set of person markers for the first and second persons. Keep these small. Monosyllabic or bisyllabic is the norm. Interestingly, there is a weak tendency for Eurasian languages to have the bilabial nasal somewhere in the first person marker and a coronal obstruent in the second person marker. Western American languages have a weak tendency to go for the alveolar nasal somewhere in the first person marker and the bilabial nasal somewhere in the second. Finally, the third person marker tends to be derived from a demonstrative. At this point, you can call it a day with regards to person and move on to number, but if you're feeling adventurous, you can reduce or expand this paradigm. Like, some languages simply don't have a third person form. If you opt for this strategy, your language will likely use straight up demonstratives when referring to third parties, and/or full nominal phrases, or maybe even zero forms, where the lack of marking indicates the third person. Homophony may also help reduce the number of distinctions in a paradigm. There is so much variation here that you can basically do what you want. Like, you could combine the first and second person markers, or the second and third, or first and third, or even all 3. If you're an expansionist, you can increase the number of person distinctions. Perhaps the most interesting way of doing this is by introducing a proximate obviate distinction. To explain, take this sentence. She here is somewhat ambiguous. It could refer to Circe, or it could refer to literally any other female. Some languages, like the Algonquin languages, get around this ambiguity by using a proximate form to mark the most important third person in an utterance, usually a subject or a topic, and an obviate form to mark an additional third person. If this sounds like your jam, derive your proximate person marker from a proximate demonstrative, and your obviate person marker from a distal demonstrative. You could even add in a further obviate third person marker, distinguishing even more third parties in a conversation. The further obviate form may be derived from a more distal demonstrative. Think something like yonder. But as always, I'd recommend not going too mad, particularly at this stage. There is so much more our person markers will need to do for us. So after person, the next most common category person markers encode is number. Most frequently, number variation crops up in a simple singular plural distinction in all 3 persons, but also commonly in just the second and first. Or only in the first. Note the homophony. But again, there is so much variation here cross-linguistically that you can kind of do whatever you want. You may even do away with the category of number altogether. In such a system, you have to be literal. Instead of saying we, you'd say something like I and you, I and he, I, she and the direwolf, etc. If your language distinguishes dual, trial or paucal forms in its nouns, it's common for such distinctions to also be present in its person paradigms. These distinctions needn't permeate the whole paradigm. As a general rule of thumb, first person markers tend to have more number distinctions than second person markers, which in turn tend to have more number distinctions than third person markers. So something like this would be naturalistic, whereas something like this would be a little more unusual. Speaking of the first person having a lot more number distinctions, let's talk clusivity. If you think about it, the first person plural we has 3 possible interpretations: speaker and addressee only, speaker, addressee and others, speaker and others, not the addressee. Technically there's a 4th, but I'm not sure if this crops up in NatLangs. Anyways, languages deal with these 3 interpretations of the first person plural in 7 different ways. English goes with the most popular option, the so-called unified we, a single first person plural form that covers all 3 interpretations of we. Next most popular is the inclusive-exclusive divide, one first person plural form for when you wish to include who you're talking to, and another for when you wish to exclude them. Next is minimal augmented, 3 forms of the first person plural, one for each of the possible interpretations. Then only inclusive, where the first person plural must include the speaker and addressee. If you wanted to indicate speaker plus a third party here, you'd have to be literal. I and he, I and she, and so on. Next is minimal inclusive, which is just like really weird. Then no we, Pretty straightforward. There's no plural first person, like in paraha from earlier. And finally, rarest of all is the augmented inclusive. One first person plural for 2 participants and another for more than 2 participants. The unified we and inclusive-exclusive strategies are by far the most common cross-linguistically, so I'd recommend choosing one of these approaches. Now, you'd think you could apply inclusivity to the second person. Indeed, there are 2 theoretically possible interpretations of the second person plural, you, but no natlang distinguishes these. Might work in a conlang though. Inclusivity may also be applied to dual, trial and paucal paradigms, if present. Just bear in mind that if such distinctions are present, they tend to also be present in the plural. If you're a speaker of an Indo-European language, it may come as a surprise to you to hear that most languages do not distinguish gender in their person markers. It'd be like replacing he and she with singular they. If you do want gender distinctions in your person markers, follow this hierarchy. That is, you can go with gender distinctions in the third person only, or in the second and third, or in all 3 persons. There are of course exceptions, but I strongly recommend going with gender in the third person only. Gender marking in the first and second is rare, mainly because there's no need for it. The genders of the speaker and addressee are usually self-evident. The gender of the third person, the party being talked about, isn't always. So, marking gender on the third person is useful because it helps to identify them and allows for multiple third persons to be used in a conversation. The third person form denoting non-masculine, non-feminine usually gets its own neuter form, or oftentimes it's lumped in with the masculine. Rarely the feminine, sometimes both, based on some culturally conditioned semantic principle. Like maybe all natural objects get the masculine it, and all man-made objects get the feminine it. As we've seen, gender tends to be based on biological sex, but you can also have humanness distinctions, or animacy distinctions. Or you could combine things, like you could have a third person masculine form and feminine form used for humans, a special form used for non-human animates, and another one used for all other referents. Gender also interacts with class. Say your conlang has 5 noun classes. You could have a system of masculine and feminine and 1 neuter form for each of the noun classes, for example. Check out Swahili for more on this. Now, I'd recommend avoiding gender distinctions in your plural markers. Singular gender marking is way more common than plural gender marking. It's easier to grok the gender of an individual as opposed to a group. But if you must, you may have gender in any or all plural forms. If so, you're going to need to decide how groups of mixed gender will be marked. Usually it defaults to masculine plural, but really, it's up to you. The marking of gender in dual, trial and paucal forms is rare, and I'd recommend avoiding it. In general, your person paradigms will decline for the same cases as your nouns. So like if you have nominative and accusative noun cases, you're likely also going to have nominative and accusative person paradigms. You may have more case distinctions in your person paradigms. This is fairly common. English, for example, doesn't have any noun cases, but it has an oblique distinction in its person markers. Having fewer distinctions in your person paradigms is uncommon, and I'd advise against it. So once you've decided on your major categories to be encoded on your person markers, you need to decide if you're going to encode them via independent person markers and/or dependent person markers. All examples so far in this video have been independent person markers. Independent person markers are separate standalone words. Think I, we, them, and so on. Dependent person markers, on the other hand, are not separate standalone words. Instead, they're little tiny bitty things tied to other words in some way. Most frequently suffixes on verbs. Think Spanish, but also stuff like clitics as in French. Your 2 options here are to go with independent markers only, or to use both independent and dependent markers. If the latter, the independent paradigms will tend to have more distinctions than the dependent ones. Like you could mark gender with your independent forms, but not your dependent ones. And/or you could go with clusivity in your independent forms, but not your dependent forms. And/or number in your independent forms only. There are examples of languages that have richer dependent paradigms than independent ones, so once again, you have a lot of choices here. TLDR, the Anadu is real when it comes to person markers. Interestingly, when both independent and dependent person markers are present, the independent forms are often optional. Spanish, for example, is a so-called pro-drop language. That is, its independent forms may be readily omitted. This is allowed because the dependent forms still convey the necessary person information. Turkish uses the optionality of its independent markers to convey a kind of obviation, something sort of like this. Along with being optional, independent markers tend to be restricted in a way that dependent forms aren't. Ao, spoken in Papua New Guinea, restricts its independent person markers to subjects only, whereas dependent forms can be used anywhere. So that's person, number, gender, and case done. But there is a truckload more person markers can do for us. So, how about we have a look at some of those next time? Good morning, interweb. This video is brought to you by World Anvil, a powerful web-based platform that lets you store, organize, and share your world-building creations. Want to create wiki-style articles for your characters, places, and events? World Anvil has you covered. Want to create interactive maps that link to those articles? World Anvil has you covered. Want to create interactive timelines to track the history of your worlds? World Anvil does that too. What about custom calendars, genealogies, organizations, and so on? Yep, it's all available on World Anvil. Click the link in the description to try out World Anvil for free. That way they'll know you came from this video. Thanks again to World Anvil for sponsoring this show. This video is also brought to you by you, the patrons. In particular, Alexander Roper, Andrew P Chehayl, Johan Spaedtke, John Hooyer, Ripta Pasay, Spencer Brownlee, Terrablae, and oh would you look at World Anvil. So they're not only a sponsor of the show, but they're also a long-time patron. Janet and Dimitri, the people who run World Anvil, are just cool folks. Check them out. Until next time, Edgar out.